Hello, one and all. I'm happy to introduce myself in this series of lectures on the plays of Shakespeare. My name is David Gamble. I am a retired teacher of having taught for some 50 years in history and English and drama and a few other things in Ontario, Canada. One of my pleasures in the profession was the teaching of Shakespeare and also mounting a few productions on stage. So I'm very pleased to present three lectures on the topic of Macbeth. I hope to reach senior high school students who may have homework and are wrestling a little with the early modern English. I hope to bring some of the aspects of the play to light in the next three lectures. Also, think perhaps early college students might get some insights if they're having term papers to write. Also, my heart goes out to the beginning teachers who are overwhelmed with the new tasks and the marking and the preparing and all of that. So maybe I can give a few clues and shorten the workload just a tad. Also, the general audience who simply want their tickets enhanced. The price of the tickets are pretty more expensive these days, and if they get a little more out of that ticket, so much the better. So, but also, all are welcome. Everyone is welcome to these in my series of Shakespeare lectures. So, Macbeth is a very popular play. It's probably the most teachable of all plays, going along with perhaps The Tempest. And people love Romeo and Juliet, particularly the young people who are not particularly non-academic. They love it. You can couple it with West Side Story. There's all kinds of things you can do with Shakespeare. So, being the most taught is well worth three lectures, which this is. My intention is to divide the task into three. The first will be the background and the times of its first presentation, a little historical background, just to make things clear, including the metaphysical background, which is extremely important in basically the grounding of Shakespeare's world, and particularly important in the plays like Lear and Hamlet, where that metaphysical hierarchy is so important and actually constructs a lot of the play for you, which I will go into at great length, at some length. Also, the terms of tragedy. How is Macbeth a tragic hero? I must admit that the lectures do overlap a bit. It's hard to just take one thing out of the play and not touch another. So I hope they're not too repetitive, but perhaps repetition, if you're a student, isn't such a bad idea. So the second will be analysis of the techniques of writing, that is, imagery, literary devices, plot structure, and in short, that which makes the drama. The third will be a more in depth look at the relationship of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and its contribution to the tragedy and how it fits in also to that metaphysical background. So I will give this overall presentation of you and hope that you will take the information away and consider it and make it your own. Make up your own interpretations with perhaps these as a bit of a grounding, just to give you a bit of the vocabulary of the understanding of Shakespeare. I hope they build a whole perspective by if you do happen to listen to all three. So, Macbeth, this is part one. As background to the play, indeed to many of Shakespeare's plays, such as Hamlet and King Lear, which are very good examples of this, by the way, and I refer to them later on, an understanding of the moral order of the universe, God's chain of being, can provide a meaningful platform. In fact, the chain of being is the invisible platform which they consider reality, the structural form or the metaphysics of the early modern world brought forward from the religious Middle Ages. It had not disappeared. It really doesn't disappear until you get the Enlightenment and the scientific method. That foundation did not disappear from the closing of the medieval times to be discarded by the Renaissance. It was not until the scientists of the Enlightenment started applying more material terms to the universe. So I would I would guide you to a lecture that I gave on Shakespeare's moral order of nature, which is a more complete treatment of some of what I'm going to do today with this. To understand the application to Macbeth, I know that the universe was believed to be a pyramid, something like this. All right, do you see that? Something like this. I'm not doing this very well. It is a pyramid, and after the Satan creates evil, the pyramid is reversed. So if you can keep that in mind, it is very structured, so that you have God, angels, human, animal, plant, mineral in descending order, orders of perfection, the closest to God. This isn't very good, um, but I think you get the idea. In fact, the chain of being is invisible plot, the structural form. The foundation did not disappear. Um, to understand this application of Macbeth, know that the universe was believed to be pyramidal. God, perfection itself, was at the highest point, the apex. However, descending the strata were less perfect. They weren't as close to God. Descending from God, who was at the top, the supreme was followed by the angels, who were more perfect than man, but less perfect than God. Next and lower were humans, not so close to the divine as angels, and yet higher than the animals, and then plants, and then minerals. Very much a very strict caste system. Imagine a pyramid with discrete layers or strata, classes being fixed in a vertical order of perfection, a rigid caste system that cemented an eternal order. So when Lucifer became Satan, he created a reverse pyramid because Satan must be the furthest from God, the absence of light, the furthest down, not up, the furthest from grace, the most evil. So he is the reverse period, the apex of which, the lower apex of which, is at the very bottom, at the bottom of chaos, which he has created, Satan has created. So and then ascending to the sort of baseline, the width of the where the two bases meet, one upside down, one right side up, you have sort of a zero, um, and the ghosts and goblins get less malevolent as you rise. So I think that's fairly clear. So there's a hierarchy of devils going upward rather than a hierarchy going downward to less perfection. Satan then was furthest from God, and the minor goblins were not as bad. The paradigm was reflected into two human estates. Now, this is going to be bad too, but I'll do my best. Perhaps if I hold it back. Okay, so if you have the feudal order, and I think you're getting everything reversed, the secular feudal, right? You got the king at the top, divine right. Very important concept in the medieval times and to the Renaissance. Divine right, primogeniture, it all fits. So that you have the king, then you have the royal family, and then you have the highest aristocracy, the lower aristocracy, you have nobility, and then gentry, and then freemen, and then you have serfs at the very bottom of this feudal pyramid. Um, the same was of the church, by the way. The church had the same organization because all institutions had to imitate God's moral order chain of being. It all had to be reflect God's rightful ways. Um, so you couldn't change anything by the human hand. There's an interesting scene in Cymbeline where Posthumus is a commoner who's married to a princess, has to be visited by the gods to elevate him to be an appropriate mate of the princess. It's also and the Elizabethans would get it, although it's sort of passing out of style. You're starting with rise of capitalism, and by 1688 you have the institution of Parliament sort of dominating the king. You've already had the Magna Carta. Things are changing, as you know, as they do very slowly. So you could be raised by someone above you, but the self mobility was not there yet. So, neither could be changed by human hand. Hence, the protagonist Macbeth, infected by his darkening soul, places ego over divine order, as does Lear and as does Hamlet's uncle. And what happens is then the kingdom falls into chaos. Even in the Tempest, his kingdom is prosperous. King has fallen into chaos because he decides to go off and become equal to the gods and practice magic. That's not where you're supposed to be. That is not your purview. So he gets shunted off to an island where he recovers and goes back in humility. Great speeches at the end, by the way, about mercy and forgiveness. Um, So, although the ones that didn't commit the crime will suffer from the degradation of the society because that line of grace that comes down is broken because that divinely anointed king has been removed and there's a gap. So, we'll see with Macbeth's Scotland what he has actually achieved in his kingdom. You could, relate to other dictators or whatever who have been nasty and brought havoc on their own country. Of course, Hitler comes to mind. That's the obvious one, but you could probably think of others. What is important to know is that in Shakespeare's time, therefore, we had the concept of divine right of kings, and it was fixed. You could not remove the anointed king, although they did it to each other. Henry Bolingbroke, King John shouldn't have been there. It should have been his nephew Arthur, etc. It did happen. Um, and in order to bless this, I mean, Charlemagne is crowned by the Pope, right? And that gives him status is a humble word for it in 800. So this was all within the ideal forms of the God's moral order and the chain of being. So such a sacrilege, particularly significant, is regicide, or this destruction of the moral order, the abrogation of the divine right of kings, because although Elizabeth had trouble finding, she didn't have an heir, so she goes to her first cousin twice removed to find, and there are problems there because they think he's a closet Catholic, and what I'm coming to is Guy Fawkes Day. Such a sacrilege is particularly significant in the court of James I, for his hold on the crown was at times tenuous. A lot of people didn't like him, and he was Scottish and didn't belong there, and he was a closet Catholic, they thought, and there was evidence for that. First, he was not English, but Scottish, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic monarch of Scotland, whose mother was Mary de Guise, a French Catholic, who was executed by her first cousin, Elizabeth I. First cousin once removed, I should say. However, monarchs were not always permanent. It was made clear by Elizabeth I's grandfather taking the throne from Richard III. This did happen. So James, it's a bit shaky. So the play makes regicide so horrific with such evil. He's not unhappy at all to have this play presented before him, especially when he has adopted the entire troupe of actors as the king's men. They knew where their bread was buttered. So to remove James on November 5th, 1605, the apparent Catholic conspirators uh, organized something called the Gunpowder Plot, and were putting all these charges below the Royal Assembly, the court. The treasonous plan to blow up the House of Lords, I should say, and its opening with James I being one of the victims. That was aborted only very shortly before the event took place. So, shockingly, the gunpowder below the house came close to being lethal for James and the others. How horrible. So, regicide was topical in 1606 at the time of the presentation of Shakespeare. After having been arrested, one of the conspirators, Guy Fawkes, said his intention was to blow you Scotch beggars back to your native mountains. They didn't want them there. Chaos would have ensued. Therefore, unity, safety, and strong rule were ever the goals of the new King of England. Precisely the stability of St. Edward the Confessor's Court as depicted in Macbeth. Where does Macduff go? To the court, the English court of Saint, notice, Edward the Confessor. The English court is pure. So you can read a lot of this when into it. When the good Macduff escapes to England, that's where he goes, and all the favorable attributes of the English court, where the Scottish find refuge, sounds like James, are played up. The setting of the grace of the English court contrasts with the hell of Macbeth, Scotland. The English would be flattered. King James I would be affirmed. There were uncertain times for the king, especially after the heinous plot. So, by the presentation of Macbeth in 1606, the usurper's treason was made pure villainy. Shakespeare's protagonist, having been corrupted by the diabolical weird sisters, a perverted and perverting wife, his own unrelenting imagination and sacrilegious ambition, justifiably, the play depicts the man who would be so treasonous with ignominy, unrelenting psychological agony, spiritual torment that he must meet his ultimate nemesis in Macduff for God's order to be reestablished, which he does, and put Malcolm, the named king by his father, on the throne. That's divine right. Although the Scots didn't really have it, they had elections and things and shows. It wasn't necessarily that automatic primogeniture. But this is an English play. Remember, the court of James I, and Shakespeare was aware of that, of course. As such, the play would flatter the wishes and ambitions of the king who had taken over Shakespeare's troupe as patron about 3 months after he ascended the throne. So it makes everybody happy. Notably, the new King James I had taken Shakespeare and his fellow players under the wing and elevated them to such royal status as his own company named the King's Men. So there's a little political background here. Why not? And remember, there's no internet and there's no TV and there's no CNN or whatever you watch, but rather the arts, the poets, the playwrights. We're not at the penny dreadful, the pamphleteering stage quite yet, but as Polonius says in Hamlet, he says these playwrights are, and I quote, for they are the abstract and brief chroniclers of our time. They tell the story. So Shakespeare is telling this story in the times of James. Okay, enough on that, I think. Macbeth is a modern drama of its day. It owes much to the resurgence of the classical tradition in the Renaissance. It seems that to move ahead in the Renaissance, they went back to the future, so that in the Renaissance period, the classical thinking was brought forward through the medieval times and ended up creating a Renaissance which focused on humanism, the intellect, etc. Right, so that when you took the tragic form, they took it from classical times, but with a difference. But we'll look at the terms of classical tragedy: protagonist, right, the first combatant; antagonist, the one who combats against. The internal and external conflict. Shakespeare's Macbeth is filled with that. Internal, very internal, very interior. Tragic flaw, which we'll discuss. Hamartia, hubris, crisis, nemesis, catastrophe, and catharsis, with fate. We'll take them all. We'll take them all and have a look at them. How do these classical terms fit into Shakespeare's play? Some of it's obvious, internal, external conflict doesn't need a lot of explanation. First, the protagonist, as the first combatant, has come to mean the hero of the tragedy. It is Macbeth. Notably, the protagonist has an exterior and interior world he wouldn't have had in the medieval morality place, but by the time the Renaissance and the humanism, etc., comes along, a much deeper introspection, and also influenced by the classical thinkers, we get that depth from inside the character and its relationship to his external action and the topography, if you will, the landscape of the outside world. The play operates on both levels. His pride, ego, internally, and his ambition for worldly gain externally drive the single protagonist. Macbeth, the physical character, is the external protagonist challenging the antagonist, right, on the outside battle. Second, the perceived antagonists expand. Now, the antagonist, it's interesting, it's not singular. It is ultimately, it's Macduff who kills him, but on the way through, he perceives antagonists, right, as his fear grows. Um, so with his uncontrollable imagination, starting from the passive Malcolm, that is a step over which I must, or a step, right? When Duncan announces that Malcolm is going to be, he says, I got to deal with that one. And that's before he even gets twisted by his wife. So this ambition had been in him already, but he hadn't acted on it. We're all tempted. He hadn't acted. He had not yet sinned in those terms. So the uncontrolled imagination, starting from this passive Malcolm through specific individuals to the entire country, becomes his enemy itself, as the hero's imagination overwhelms him as he imagined threats of potential antagonists to increasing degrees until his paranoia is total. Wow. His friend Banquo, placed on the list, must die with his son. He kills his friend, his best friend, his foil. While the ultimate external final antagonist is Macduff, his accumulation of fears will destroy him. There is a nemesis, of course, involved in the final catastrophe. In that sense, he becomes doomed by his own uncontrolled imagination, his tragedy. I believe that's a tragic flaw. Tragedy of imagination. Externally, it's a tragedy of ambition, and that's what most people kind of talk about. But it's the tragedy of the imagination, and we'll look at some of the line references to support that. In that sense, he becomes doomed by his own uncontrolled imagination. I repeat, his tragedy. Directly due to the uncontrollable self-torture of his imagination, his audience sees his most unconquerable antagonist as an internal one. His interior drives the exterior. At first, the initial antagonist would appear to be Duncan's son. King Duncan announces, "We will establish our estate upon our eldest Malcolm, whom we name hereafter the Prince of Cumberland." That's Act 1, Scene 4, line 39. Macbeth's reaction is immediate in the early scene, for his imagination, which drives his ambition, has been provoked by the witches, a temptation that shall be king hereafter. Imagination, which drives his ambition, has been provoked by the witches, a temptation that he had had before meeting them. It's a natural thing for lots of people to just want more, be higher, status, wealth, power, all of that. The interior has been dormant, but is now aroused. Immediately inside, Macbeth directs his ego. And this is the line that I just quoted a little earlier. "The Prince of Cumberland, that is a step on which I must fall down, or leap. For in my way it lies." We get that in Act 1, Scene 4, line 48. However, while Malcolm, the interior of the crown, the inheritor of the crown, never does battle hand to hand with Macbeth. He just is put on the throne by stronger people. Macduff takes the role of nemesis, Macbeth's nemesis. He gets him in the end. The protagonist must combat many more antagonists before Macduff makes the crown safe for Malcolm. Furthermore, the progress of the drama reveals that our tragic hero will perceive antagonists to an ever-increasing degree. They will become Scotland itself. The external world is his enemy, although he wants it to start with. You can see the nemesis there and the horrible tragic irony, the very world he fought for. So his internal lust for power destroys him, leads him to doom. In Act 3, Scene 1, the impending opposition is captured in a pair of soliloquies. The first is Banquo's iterating his suspicions, and the second, Macbeth's confirming them. There's in this scene there is a parallel. There's a balance between the foil, the good man, who has been tempted, by the way. He says, "Oh, well, why can't my kids be?" By the way, she said, "My kids are going to inherit the throne. Why can't I be up there?" So he can be tempted too, but he is the good man, and he resisted. That's different. In Act 3, Scene 1, the impending opposition is captured in a pair of soliloquies. The first is Banquo's iterating his suspicions, and the second, Macbeth's confirming them. Nice parallel structure to this scene. Shakespeare is no slouch. Banquo, as the antagonist, has been set up as a moral being, tempted without falling into sin, the foil. The following two soliloquies lead to the climax in the banquet scene where Macbeth blows his cover in front of the Thanes, never regaining his reputation, and that's the crisis. That's where it all ends. At this point, Banquo knows, so Banquo must go. Thou, he says in the soliloquy, hast it now, King, Cawdor, Glamis, all, as the weird women promised. And I fear thou playedst most foully for it. Yet it was said it should not stand in thy posterity, not with your kids, but that myself should be the root and father of many kings. If there come truth from them, as upon thee, Macbeth, their speeches shine, why, by the verities, the truths, the verities on thee made good, may they not be my oracles as well, and set me up in hope? That's Act 3, Scene 1, line 1 to 10. It's a good parallel that Shakespeare is creating, the foil and the protagonist. In Act 3, Scene 1, Banquo is seen as a dire threat with his son fleeance. Macbeth makes that clear. He fears Banquo's moral nature, his physical courage, and his intelligence. So the good is a danger. We're getting the moral reversal, right? After the killing of Duncan, because the grace is not coming down anymore, it stopped. And his intelligence, which are Banquo's control, all qualities Macbeth lacks. It's his foil. These interior qualities manifest themselves in mortal opposition in Macbeth's mind, just as the juxtaposition of soliloquies emphasizes. Here he fears his mind has been filed, he says. For Banquo's issue have I filed my mind. Now, he has defiled, or has he taken an iron instrument and shaved part of it away? It's a really violent image, but that's to play. Or defoil, reshaped by a jagged metal instrument, tormented with rancors. And Banquo hasn't done anything bad to him at all. Just his existence is the problem, is the threat. And he has sacrificed his soul to Satan, all to have fleance on the throne. Oh dear. He is horrifically aware of his own damnation and gives himself up to fate, using the free will with which God has granted the soul in an active choice to engage in more murders. And I'll read. To be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus. Our fears in Banquo stick deep, and in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. 'Tis much he dares. And to that dauntless temper of his mind he hath a wisdom that guides his valor to act in safety. There is none but he whose being I do fear, and under him my genius, that is his posterity, his kids, family, dynasty, is rebuked. Prophet-like, they hailed him as father to a line of kings. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none, if you remember. And upon my head placed a fruitless crown, put a barren, that's no fecundity, no kids, a barren scepter in my grip, thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand. No son of mine succeeding. He may choose to have kids. Lady Macbeth says she had a kid. We don't know where the kid is. May have passed away, maybe a former marriage, but they're young. They can still have kids. For Banquo's issue have I filed my mind, to put rancors in the vessel of my peace, only for them and mine eternal jewel given to the common enemy of men. He knows his soul is going to hell. Act 3, Scene 1, 47 to 68. The audience had been set up for this at the beginning of the scene. The pairing adds value to the binary moral code. The dramatist has given us Macbeth's confession, for the protagonist is fully aware of the consequences of his action, the filing of his mind for man's enemy. The combatants are squared off. However, the ultimate antagonist is Macduff. Of course, by the time he has fled to sanctuary in the English court of St. Edward the Confessor, Macbeth's family has been butchered. However, by this time, Macbeth, in his paranoia, has taken the entire nation to be his antagonist. As Macduff witnesses to Malcolm, he testifies that in bedeviled Scotland, anyone, man, woman, or child, can be an enemy. In grim irony, Macbeth is unaware that Macduff is unaware that Macbeth has slaughtered his wife and children. However, we, the audience, know. So when he's speaking, the dramatic irony is very intense. Throughout the country, the cries, the miseries, the carnage, the sorrows abound as Macduff bears witness. Each new morn, new widows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strike heaven on the face, that it resounds as if it felt with Scotland and yelled out like syllable of dolor. That's sorrow. 4.3, 4 to 8. The Scottish people, it would seem, have become the enemy to the perverted imagination of the protagonist, for his wild construction of his opposition has gone much past Malcolm, potentially to Banquo, and then to any and all, and finally, in the grand finale, narrowed to the resolute Macduff, his nemesis, who is retributive justice. In the final act, because Macduff's family is not exempt from the butchery, the cleansing of the country of this malevolence will fall to the ultimate opposite, Macduff, to restore God's moral order under the rightful ruler. That's Malcolm. In terms of the archetypal battle between good versus evil, battles between the nefarious evil one and God's munificent grace, devil versus angel, would sit comfortably with the early 16th century audience that feared the dangers of demons and devils. They believed in them. Remember, in 1692, you have the hanging in Salem by the colonial British, right, of the famous witches in the Crucible story. In 1597, James I and VI of Scotland had written a book called Demonology. He was a very bright, cultured man. He wrote books. He was a poet. He was a man of study, and which was in his book, Demonology. Demonology was a study of the many means by which demons could harass humans. Now, we wouldn't give it much consideration. I don't think many of us would, but in his day, and coming from the king and the educated class, it would not be refused. Later, James had it reprinted in England after he acceded the English throne in 1603, after Elizabeth I passes away. Shakespeare appeals to the same cosmic drama which Malcolm wins. It would have sat well with the king and have elicited knowing responses from the playgoers. This would have gone over well and easily and smoothly. We see it perhaps as a, not sci-fi, but as a fantastic movie, right? With such metaphysics in mind, Malcolm refers to the archfiend. He says, angels are bright still. Though the brightest fell, that's Lucifer, who became Satan. He was God's second, right? Lucifer, the light bearer. Lucifer means the carrier of the light. Lux, Pharaoh. Fairy is in the boat, and Lux, which means is Latin for light. He was the light bearer. Angels are bright still, though the brightest fell. Though all things foul would wear the boughs of grace, yet grace must still look so. Goodness can't dissimulate to look, it can't pretend to be other than it is. Evil can pretend to be good, so be careful. It's a warning. It's Act 4, Scene 3, line 22. So be careful. And Malcolm refers to it, right? He knows that Macbeth may have looked great at the very beginning when he was conquering all those nasty people, but inside there was something else going on. In 1606, such a line would have been accepted, enhancing the drama to the metaphysical level explained earlier. This play is not just it's not a material play. It's more of a metaphysical play. There's no art, and this is what Malcolm has said in Act 4, there's no art to find the mind's construction in the face. Evil will beguile. Virtue cannot dissimulate. A lesson that escapes Macbeth in his fear of Banquo and Macduff. The witches say clearly, beware Macduff, Act 4, Scene 1. 71. And continue with none of woman born shall harm Macbeth, Act 4, Scene 1, 80 to 81. His trust in the equivocation will destroy him. He doesn't understand that dissimulation. He believes this act of faith because it satisfies his imagination. Evil can look honest and dissimulate, but virtue can only look like itself. Macbeth fails to understand this and confuses the two, particularly in the witches, in the equivocation. He doesn't get it. For the audience, this superstitious moment in plot development reflects King James' writing and the culture of the times. It reflected the contemporary understanding of how unseen forces work within that world. In this sense, while the play has roots in medieval morality plays, this 16th century drama is more developed. The earlier dramas were more naive, never reaching the depths of or intensity of imagination, existential doubts, and nihilism that pour forth from this narrative. The exposition of Macbeth's soul goes far beyond this simplistic interior drama of Everyman, for example, the simplistic Everyman, a great play. I put it on with the kids once. Everyman from the 15th century. Things have developed with the Renaissance and the recapturing the swerve back to the classical thinking. The interiorization of this Renaissance drama as internal conflict is characteristic of that early modern period. The focus is on the individual, which the author develops in stark terms following the first temptation to the final destruction of his soul in Act 5. Taken from the classical tragedies, the intensity of the internal conflict develops from what is known as the tragic flaw or hamartia, that defect in character of the tragic hero that leads to his downfall. Hamartia, an essential concept for understanding tragedy. Here we are in the classical terms now, applying them as they brought the tragic form forward to the Renaissance. To understand tragedy, the hamartia is an error in judgment, which may proceed from ignorance or moral shortcoming. Well, there you go. Some trait of the protagonist that is out of balance. In Macbeth's case, the simple answer would be that his overwhelming ambition is his moral shortcoming. The error in judgment stems from his inability to control his imagination, and he judges the witches to be safe. However, the deeper interior flaw of Macbeth must be his delusional, uncontrollable imagination, which destroys his reason. Banquo asks, have we eaten of the insane root that takes the reason prisoner? Act 1, Scene 3, line 84 to 85. Macbeth corroborates after having been named the Thane of Cawdor. Why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs, get this, against the use of nature? We're back to the moral order again. Act 1, Scene 3, 137. He knows nature, God's order, would be in violation, but he ignores the warning and moves forward. His temptation defies the moral order of nature. He is not naive, for he knows full well the nature of the impending evil. One by one, his soliloquies chart his journey, moving from one lurid imagining to another, from invisible bloody daggers to full seas becoming blood, to ghosts of Banquo shaking his gory locks, to the sickening of destruction, to the suicide of Lady Macbeth, for whom he feels little by the end, or nothing, and the death of the imagination itself on an empty stage, it's signifying nothing. The nemesis, the payback, is complete. He is left with nothing. For even his imagination, which was so important, which was so dominant and overpowering, is dead. From the lurid imagination leading him, he ends with the emptiness of nihilism. His life is nothing, nada. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It's a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's him at the end. Before, oh, wow. The author captures the interior catastrophe with bleak poetry, for the protagonist has destroyed the very imagination that led him to his external conflict when all is said and done. The interior led the exterior, the external. Now both are gone, internal and external. His psyche is emptiness. His gains are spent in the final catastrophe, the devastation in the country, the suicide of his wife, his own defeat by Macduff. The world has suffered and he has lost. The catastrophe, the ultimate destruction of the protagonist, is complete. But it's a spiritual destruction, a psychological destruction, not just a material loss. Nemesis, the payback for the destruction for which he is guilty, is just. It is just that he go the way he did. In the classical tradition, tragic tradition, his hubris, that ego, has been paid back. In the Renaissance Christian world, his fall comes from his own sin of pride, the root and source of all sin. He has destroyed himself and has lost his soul. But for one consideration, catharsis. It's a slippery concept. Catharsis means a purgation, an exhaustion in the audience, being taught between pity and fear and horror and hope and some kind of redemption, maybe. And so this going back and forth between pity for the characters and fear of the catastrophe implies a spending of all emotions, which may be a relief after the ordeal rather, has been suffered. After it's over, you think, oh, I'm glad that's over. The emotions must be intense and powerful for the catharsis to take place. So it's the obliteration generated by fear and horror. And with Macbeth, there's this little bit at the end where you just, okay, the bad guy is gone, you killed him, you wiped the floor with him, etc. Oh, what a relief. Okay, but that's sort of satisfying, right? The bad guy gets it. But in this case, he regains stature. What are you going to do with this guy? You are with him psychologically. You have known him so well. You don't abandon him now. So in the progress of the drama, Macbeth has been reduced, even metaphorically, castrated by his bullying wife. He has destroyed the unity of the formerly admiring Thanes by destroying their country's safety and security. He's been led to destruction by the phantasmagoria. He has destroyed the overwhelming imagination, and all that is left is nihilism. However, in the conclusion, he recovers a vestige of his former self. For when Birnam Woods comes to the castle, he marches out to face the nemesis, ring the alarm bell. Blow wind, come rack, at least we'll die with harness on our back. That's Act 5, Scene 5, line 51. That trembling man who is infirm of purpose, that's Act 2, Scene 2, 51, that's Lady Macbeth, having been twisted by his wife, has rediscovered a degree of courage and a shred of manhood. And later he says to Macduff, just before the end, I will not yield to kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet, but to be baited with the rabble's curse. Though Birnam Wood be come to Dunsinane, and thou opposed, being of no woman born, yet I will try the last. Before my body I throw my warlike shield, lay on Macduff, and damned be him that cries, hold enough. Act 5, Scene 8, line 28. In its own way, there is a reconstitution of self of this condemned one, not a spiritual redemption that you would get in King Lear or Hamlet, but a recovery of the original man, that Bellona's bridegroom, the worthiest cousin, that brave Macbeth, actually is rediscovered to a degree. So he must rise in the audience estimation just enough that we still identify with him. How confusing. After all the horror, right? And all the black imagery and horrible reversals, and the death of children, the slaughter of children. And yet, yeah, exhausting. So it is really a confusion to kind of identify even a little with this monster. The catharsis confusion, as it is in Hamlet and King Lear, confusion is bewilderment. I won't go into Hamlet and King Lear. It's there. Hamlet forgives Laertes. I've shot my arrow over the house and hurt my brother. I'm sorry. And Lear with Cordelia, I can't read the speech without crying, that they will be God's spies and look at the world and not be in it, but sort of over it. and they will have each other, and they will forgive each. Oh my God, forgive each other. I'm getting choked up now. It is such a beautiful speech. And after Lear's madness and insane egotistical hubris, he rediscovers his soul. Macbeth doesn't get anywhere near that. Nowhere near that. But there's a dignity restored. Okay. Okay. Fate. The ending imposed by the gods from which there is no escape is core to the classical Greek drama. This is not true in Macbeth. He is not condemned and fights against an absolute. He is tempted, he is played with, the witches make mess of his mind, his imagination, which he allows to take over himself. His wife he allows to take over him, but there's still the man, and he is responsible. And if you're going, there's my teacher, sorry. Uh, there you have the individual soul is responsible for his own salvation in Christian terms. For Oedipus, there's no escape. There is for him, because free will was doctrine. So the his hamartia, his errant judgment, is his seeing the witches as fate. Weird, by the way, in Old English, I think it was actually a Viking word that came through the north. I won't go into the history. For fate, the word meant fate. Um, so he makes that mistake, and he says to Lady Macbeth, he says they have more in them than mortal knowledge. I believe his hubris leads him to hamartia, that errant judgment. The sin of pride has captured his soul. And he comes toward the end, though, as the woods come from Burnham Wood to Dunsinane. Truth slaps him in the face. I pull in resolution and begin to doubt the equivocation of the fiend that lies like truth. And there's the equivocation. If the audience has listened to the witches, the audience would predict. Therein lies a tragic and dramatic irony as Macbeth careens toward destruction, lured by the equivocation of the fiend. The author makes it clear, having been insulted by the sailor's wife, the witch decides to take revenge on her husband. Torture him she can, but kill him she can't. And this applies to the play. The fates cannot kill you in Christian Renaissance. Sleep shall neither night nor day hang upon his penthouse lid. He shall live a man forbid. Weary 7 nights, 9 times 9, shall he dwindle peak and pine. Though his bark, that is ship, cannot be lost, though he shall be tempest tossed, we can wreak havoc for him, but we can't drown him. Like Macbeth, we can't kill him. So we're getting close to the end. Bear with. The analogy is taken seriously. Macbeth is tortured, but they can't destroy him, as with the sailor. And that's, I think, why it is there. In the Christian Renaissance culture, one's soul must be lost by one's own free will. And there are parallels to other Shakespearean tragedies, but we'll leave that. So, in the Tudor period, drama came a long way from the allegorical medieval morality plays. Allegories with representative characters had demonstrated virtue according to the moral order of the universe, God's chain of being. The battle of good and evil, as captured later by John Milton's Paradise Lost, he captured it. It's a good read, by the way. The good parts, it does get a bit long. Paradise, following the terror of every man facing his judgment, are embellished with deeply psychological probing in the Renaissance with the rise of humanism and the construction of the individual. That concept was a construction. There came the profundity of the artist's insights, the brief chroniclers of our time. Humanity could look into the mirror provided by the arts. Hence, Shakespeare et al. Had become the luminous universals of global literature. So following this presentation, that does it for now. Thank you. Following this presentation, parts 2 and 3, there is a degree of repetition, which I apologize for, but I thought it was necessary at the time. And these are quite salient things, and repetition doesn't hurt. So I hope you enjoyed this segment, and follow the other two to complete the appreciation if you choose to do so. Thank you, and good day to you all.